I'd like to welcome everyone to our Belfint briefing today, Protecting Your Business from Today's Cyber Threats, with nationally recognized cyber expert Bob Anderson. I would also like to introduce myself. I'm Valerie Middlebrooks. I'm a director at Belfint Lyons & Schumann in the Tax and Small Business Department. Thank you for joining us. First, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. So the session will be recorded today and posted to the Belfint website, so you'll have access to review or share the content after the presentation. Please ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, rather than the chat feature. We have disabled the chat feature for this purpose. There will be 4 polling questions during the session, and anyone that is seeking CPE credit must respond to at least 3 of the 4 questions. Our session will run until 11 o'clock, and we're reserving the last 15 minutes for Q&A. I would also like to thank the participants for the questions submitted with your RSVPs. If we do not get to some of these questions, someone will follow up with you after the presentation. I would also like to remind you that a survey will be sent after the conclusion of the session. In pre-pandemic times, we would have welcomed you to help yourself to breakfast and coffee during the presentation and directed you to the restrooms should they be needed. So if you need a snack or a bathroom break, please do the same from your comfort of your home or office. Now I would like to introduce Bob Anderson, our keynote speaker. I served on the Delaware Society of Certified Public Accountants Board of Directors with Bob's wife for several years, and through her, learned of all the amazing things Bob has worked on over the years. I also had the pleasure to hear him speak at one of the Society's annual meetings and was fascinated by the topic and the manner in which he presents it. I guess what I'm trying to say is he presented it in such a way that even my accountant brain could comprehend what some of the issues were. Also, as a business owner, much like you all, protecting our business information and integrity is paramount to what we do. So Robert E. Anderson Jr. is a former national security executive and renowned cybersecurity expert. Anderson is CEO of Cyber Defense Labs, a full lifecycle information security service provider, helping companies manage, detect, and respond to today's cyber risks. A former Delaware state trooper who also served for more than 20 years with the FBI, Anderson ultimately rose in his career to become Executive Assistant Director of the FBI's Criminal Cyber Response and Services branch, overseeing all FBI criminal and cyber investigations worldwide, international operations, critical incident response, and victim assistance. While serving in the FBI, Anderson directed strategic initiatives and operations for several high-profile investigations, including those involving Sony Pictures Entertainment, the Office of Personnel Management, the San Bernardino shooting, Edward Snowden investigation, and many others. As CEO of Cyber Defense Labs, he and his team have responded to hundreds of cyber-related events. He has been retained as an expert witness for several ongoing litigations relating to some of the nation's largest cyber breaches, and frequently provides insight and analysis on television and in the media, including CBS's 60 Minutes. So without further ado, thank you, Bob, for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
So much. It's a pleasure being here with you guys today. Looking forward to the conversation. Please, as you brought up to everybody that's listening to this, if you have questions, comments, or thoughts as we go through this, please write in or do whatever you need to do to get the question out so we can talk about it. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about today. I've got a presentation prepared for everybody that's on the screen and on the webcast today. And then following that, obviously, we'll answer some of the questions that you've submitted prior to the webinar, as well as 2 or 3 different investigations that I've been involved in, some of which were mentioned, to just give you some flavor on how sophisticated nowadays Cybercrime is, and quite frankly, protecting your own company, whether it's a teeny little tiny company or a $60 billion company. The threats are very complicated nowadays. Hopefully, though, we can simplify them and get to some good answers for you guys, for your companies that you have today. And here's the first polling question I think that's coming at everybody. We'll hit all of these items today. It's great to get an idea from everyone out there on exactly what they're looking for. I really think one of the biggest things you can do for the least amount of money for your company is educate your staff, educate the people that work with you every day on the threat that is actually out there. And this doesn't mean necessarily bringing in, a company to perform some type of formal training program. And I'll tell you why. What you see and hear and read about in the news or on the newspaper or on TV, quite frankly, is the tip of the iceberg. Let me give you real facts off the polling questions here, which talked about general education is obviously a high need, and I agree with you. And by far, I will tell you that educating your staff and educating the people inside your company will do wonders for protecting you from cybercrime and cyber criminals. When I was the executive assistant director of the FBI would open huge cyber cases, several thousand a year globally. Most of them were giant cases like OPM or Ed Snowden or Sony. I can go on and on, unfortunately. But the reality is the amount of cyber crime that's going on outside of what you do not see in the paper eclipses it. To give you an idea, just one major firm in the defense contracting space could be attacked through cyber means and blocked, but attacked 3 to 4 million times a day. And quite frankly, in the cyber business nowadays, that's quite routine. So in most states, the laws differ on what you have to report and who you need to talk to, depending if you're a public company, a private company, whether you've lost PII, personal identifiable information, or PCI, credit card information, or PHI, right, healthcare information. So most of the breaches that happen, most of the ransomwares that happen, quite frankly, you'll never hear about. Give you a real life example. When I came out of the FBI in 2015 and ran my first practice, my practice responded to over 700 breaches a year, every year. That's 2 a day, every day. I spoke to the FBI in 3 to 4 years of running that practice one time. That's it. So the scale of what's actually out there is immense. And I think by educating your employees, not by scaring them, but letting them know that this environment is real and there's various different ways that people can attack your infrastructure, can attack your company. And the fact that they only read about, one cyber breach every few weeks or every month in the paper or see it on TV, the two things you need to remember about that breach is, I guarantee you it happened 6 months to a year ago. It did not just happen. There's been a bunch of stuff going on in the background between companies like mine that are going in and investigating and remediating that breach. And then there's a prepared statement for either stockholders, shareholders, depending on what the company is. So one, it's way old, and two, it's happened by sophisticated means, and there's more of those happening than you'll ever see. And I really think that's puts it in perspective for employees and people that own these companies and run these companies, that just because you don't see it in the paper doesn't mean it's not happening daily all over this country. And I think that's an important part of that. And so going back to your initial polling question before I hit the threat environment, one of the biggest things you can do for your employees is educate them. And again, it doesn't need to be a formal education program. What I just told you, I think also helps, that this stuff is real and it happens daily. Let's talk about the threat environment. And it doesn't matter if you're making $500,000 a year gross profit as a company, or you're making $60 billion a year as a company. Business attacks have become more persistent and more evolving over the last 3 to 4 years than I've seen in my entire 30-year career. And let me say that again, because this is something everybody should key off of. The depth, scope, sophistication of these attacks have become greater and greater and more frequent over the last 3 years. I'm going to hit a couple of the means that they'll attack or try to attack a company, but by no means is this the only way that they'll do it. But one of the reasons they can do it with such persistence and such accuracy, and this is real, and we need to touch on this. In the early 1980s, when I became a state trooper in Delaware, the only way anybody could rob your store, rob your house, rob you personally, they needed to touch you. They needed to go to your house. They needed to grab a hold of you physically. They needed to break into your business, right? Nowadays, they can be sitting in a third-party country tens of thousands of miles away and launch attacks into thousands of companies at the same time across the United States. Well, how can they do that? How can these type of attacks happen with such frequency? Well, I'll tell you, the main reason, and this is why I think the attacks have increased so drastically over the last several years is, and you've heard about this, I'm sure in the papers, but there's something out there called the dark web, the Tor router system. And now think of it this way, because again, this is real. You and I, when we're at home and we're on the internet, we'll go look up Home Depot or Lowe's or a lawn service or somebody that can come out and fix something that's wrong in our house. There's a whole nother illicit universe out there on the internet that the entire internet on that side of the house is built to steal, to traffic, to commit espionage, to sell tools so people can actually make these attacks. In the early, say, 1990s going into the 2000s, when I was in the FBI, back in those days, it was all criminal violations, organized crime, gangs. We started obviously getting heavy into counterterrorism way before 9/11, and obviously after 9/11, it was a huge focus within the intelligence community and the FBI. But back then, to actually break into a business via the internet, via cybercrime, you actually needed to be a hacker. You actually needed to know and understand how to hack into these types of systems. The IT infrastructure, whether it's a small teeny company or a very large global company. The advent of the dark web and the ability for people to then buy this technology so that they can go out and launch these attacks has made that all go away. So an average person can now buy a script, buy malware, buy a ransomware attack. They can buy surveillance of your company. They can actually employ somebody to surveil your infrastructure, to look for vulnerabilities, to launch an attack with probably about 99% chance of it actually working. Where in the old days, right, they needed to hack into that. Nowadays, that's not the way it works at all. And I think that's why this threat has become so persistent, so evolving, and quite frankly, so sophisticated. Ransomware attacks nowadays, which we'll cover a little later on in this presentation, compared to ransomware attacks 5 to 10 years ago. 5 to 10 years ago, you could bring a company in like mine. You could bring in the United States intelligence community if you were a large company, and we probably could help you reverse engineer the ransomware and malware, probably get your data back, probably avoid you to have to pay any type of ransom to anybody. I will tell you nowadays, if you get attacked by sophisticated ransomware, you could bring in my company, you could bring in the FBI, CIA, and NSA, and they're not going to decrypt it for you. It's impossible almost. The sophistication of those attacks and the type of hexadecimal codes that they use, which is a fancy name for a lot of numbers and a lot of letters strewn out over 64 to 124 bit encryption, is a way that they would decode that stuff. Nowadays, it's almost impossible. So you need to be having a conversation about what if, and we'll hit this a little later on. Let's talk about phishing. Just so you know, when we talk about phishing campaigns or business email compromises or ransomware, There's a variety of these things. I'm talking big picture right now, just so you get the comprehension. But phishing breaks into spear phishing and a variety of other different things. Don't worry about that right now. The key thing that you need to know about phishing campaigns, they're not the same as they were 2 years ago. Most of us remember back when we first got an email account or when we first went on, you would get these weird emails that had incorrect English. They didn't spell your name right. The URI or the identifier or where they're coming from looked strange. It doesn't look like that anymore. They look very much like a friend of yours from Facebook or somebody in your company has been sending you these emails for years. So the chances of them being able to get that through into your system are increasingly greater and greater. Now, depending on the size of your company and depending how dispersed you are now, which we're going to talk a lot about since COVID, most people are working remotely, working from home, or even if they're in the office, they're only working with a third of the staff, maybe. And so phishing attacks right now are off the hook. We see them every day. Our clients are calling us to help them get out of the situations that they've been put in by these attacks. The one thing you want to look at from a phishing attack is an end to a means. It's a way for me, if I'm a bad guy or bad gal, to get into your company and then try to do something to you. It's not actually the piece of the attack. You can't look at it like, well, we had a phishing email, we avoided it, therefore we're fine. Depending on what has happened with that email in your company, it may just be the beginning of a surveillance exercise. And when I say surveillance, it's people that are actually looking at your company's infrastructure, looking at your org structure, looking at who the CEO is, looking at who the CFO is, looking at how you pay your bills. Do you pay them via bank transfer? Do you pay them online? How do you do this? So just because you stopped a phishing attack or a couple of phishing attacks, employees have opened it, but not necessarily, they don't believe, clicked on anything. Nowadays, that may or may not be enough. So just in your head, for the purposes of today, you should be looking at, one, phishing attacks are extremely complex anymore. They're very sophisticated. They look like normal emails. They don't look like the emails we used to see. And they're an ends to a means. Let's talk about one of those ends, right? Business email compromise. The standard thing that happens today, still today, we get like 3 of these a week from companies that are small to big that says, listen, I just got an invoice sent to me by a subcontractor and we just wired out $250,000 and the subcontractor called us back 2 days later and said, when are you going to pay me? And that money is now gone. These things happen daily. They still happen to small to large businesses. We had one the other week for over $1 million, a very sophisticated company. People are under pressure. People are in their jobs. They're demanding to get a lot of things done. They're trying to homeschool their children. They're trying to manage COVID, and they're trying to do their job. And they're getting multiple invoices in a day. And a business email compromise is a perfect example of a phishing attack, where I can get in and look at the company and look at who pays the bills. Matter of fact, I can intercept potentially one of those bills, see what the header looks like. I can then reverse engineer maybe one letter off, one number off of an email that you correspond with all the time and submit a bill for an erroneous company that has done work for you, or maybe not, or maybe it is a real company that has done work for you, but this isn't a real invoice. And without some type of follow-up in the accounting, payroll, AR, however you're doing it, that money's out the door. Now, what I would recommend for most people in these type of events nowadays, if you don't have it, I don't care how big your company is, how little company is. We have it in place in my company for a certain amount of billable receipts. When it hits a certain threshold, there's no question. There has to be a phone call between the parties. I don't care if the phone call takes 5 seconds. Hey, Jim, hey, Sally, did you send me this $37,500 bill? Is this the right account number I'm transferring the money to? You would not believe how many companies, big and small, are not doing that. And they're losing millions of dollars over a year. That is probably one of the greatest attacks we're seeing right now in the whole COVID environment, because it's easy. It doesn't matter if you're on a VPN, which we'll talk about later. It doesn't matter if you're really looking at emails. If they already know who you are and know the infrastructure of your company, that's a problem. So think about that. I want to skip ransomware for a second and hit insider threat, because there's two different types of insider threats, and then we'll hit ransomware. Insider threat for most businesses, look at it this way. For most businesses, 99% of the time, it is a conscientious employee that is either overworked or juggling a million things, that pulls up an email, clicks on something wrong, downloads a file, does something erroneously. They're not doing it intentionally to destroy or damage your company. However, the consequences of their act has now compromised your entire integrity of your IT system. Okay? So that's an insider threat when I talk about private sector. Now, don't get me wrong, because in my career, I've arrested hundreds of these people that are insider threats in the private sector, and they're there to steal intellectual property, they're there to embezzle money, they're there to do whatever. It's a very, very, very small percentage. Most of the time, and what I've seen in the last 5 or 6 years of running practices and being the CEO for the last 2.5 years of a very large cyber company in Dallas, that's not what it is. It's a conscientious employee that makes a mistake. Therefore, going back to education, which we talked about early on, okay? Insider threat, if I put my old FBI hat, national security hat on, that's an Ed Snowden. That's somebody that's a Bob Hansen that we arrested in the FBI. And unfortunately, 3 other people I arrested inside the FBI for trying to sell classified information to a foreign power. That's a whole different story. When we talk in this environment, for most cases, an insider is a good employee that's done something that's now compromised the integrity of your IT infrastructure. Going back to education, it's a must. Let's talk about ransomware. Ransomware, I hit on it a little bit. One of the things that I think everybody needs to understand about ransomware, and I don't think most companies know this, most of the time when a ransomware attack happens, the bad guy or bad gal that has launched those attacks has not necessarily launched that attack and understand who is actually going to be compromised. So they may push this attack out across 3,000 companies, and they may or may not be in the same kind of vertical within the private sector, right? Healthcare, education, accounting, finance. They may or may not be. And so a lot of times, and if you've never experienced a ransomware attack, if it's a large scale one, usually it happens something like this. You go to log onto your computer in the morning, and the minute you pull your computer up, usually there's like a dragon or some fire or like a really angry character that says, you've been under attack in 24 hours and 32 minutes and 19 seconds. We're going to destroy all your data unless you pay us X. And the reason I bring up to you this, 3-4 years ago, these ransomware attacks had a much lower ransom. The ransoms nowadays are escalating into the millions of dollars. Now, in most cases, unless it's a very focused attack, which by the way, they are those types of attacks, but in most cases, they're general lists. They're a general list of attacks. They don't even understand what company you are or what your economic capability is. So if you're under an attack like this and you don't have segmented data, you don't have redundancy data, and if you don't understand what I'm talking about that, it's simple. Look at it like a submarine. If I can shut a door off and that bad guy or bad gal can't move to my next IT infrastructure server, then I've got segmented data. Look at it really simple. If I have complete backups of every client, file, employee, history of my company, I technically could cut everything away, buy new computers, new hard drives, and move on and not pay the ransom, right? I will tell you, in my experience in the private sector, 95% of the companies unfortunately end up paying a ransom. When I was in the FBI, if you would ask me, should I pay a ransom? I would have told you no. I mean, we did routinely on kidnappings to get people back and then make sure that they were all right. But obviously in anything else, we would always say no. I will tell you, the men and women that have worked with me over the last 5 or 6 years, we've probably paid 4 clients, 600 plus ransoms, and it's millions and millions and millions of dollars. Why? because when their systems are locked up, they can't pay payroll, can't bring in any clients, they can't do work. In most cases, they can't get their data back because it's not segmented. It's not in any way blocked off to stop the spread of the attack. They don't have redundancy data. That can be very expensive nowadays. And so you need to look, if you're attacked by ransomware, this is beyond a business interruption for most businesses. This is a business emergency. And it requires swift action from companies that actually know how to negotiate with these people. And I want to hit this for a second. And you can see the statistics on cybercrime from the FBI and how long it usually takes to see vulnerabilities, or how long it's been since they've actually breached into your company. Usually it's months and months and months, close to a year, before they actually launch these attacks. But the key is, when you negotiate with a bad guy or bad gal, in most times, they have no idea who you are. So a sophisticated cyber company can negotiate that ransom way down. And then here's the key. There's no honor among thieves. Trust me when I say that. I've got a lot of experience in it. And here's what's been happening in the last 2 years. And so if you don't have a company that knows what they're doing to help you, here's what's going to happen. Say you get a ransom for, I'm making this up, $50,000, and your entire system shut down. And you have a company that comes in and says, no problem, I've done this a couple times, let me negotiate with the bad guy, bad gal. We open an encrypted chat. They start negotiating. By the way, these people are usually very friendly. If you don't know how to buy Bitcoin or virtual currency, they'll usually walk you through on how to buy it. This is a $1 trillion business, by the way, globally, $1 trillion business. Unfortunately, crime pays. That's why people do it. But the bottom line is, if you just pay that person thinking they're going to give you the code to then restore your data, in the last couple of years, what has been happening is other bad guys have intercepted the malware ransomware attack en route. And now they've sent you the email. They've sent you the encrypted chat to pay them. They could not give you the code if their life depended on it. They have no idea what the decryption key is for this. So without a company coming in and then looking, negotiating, and actually what we call, give me a sign of life to show that you can actually decode a bit of this data, and then let me review it, our team review it, to make sure there's not a payload in it. And what I mean by payload is a bomb that's basically going to go off in your computer system 5 months, 10 days, 20 hours, and 18 seconds later. And by the way, we'll talk about this later. Even if you have an MSSP, which is laying on your endpoints, you're never going to pick this up because it's already in your system. So the key to this and what we're talking about is, again, understanding the threat that is actually out there today. And when it comes to ransomware, and as I'm talking about this, obviously look at your next polling question. But when it comes to ransomware and it comes to the sophistication of these attacks, and then actually dealing with the bad guy or bad gal, unless you have redundancy data and the ability to just cut it away, you immediately need to have a conversation, I would say, with two parties. Whoever your legal counsel is, because you want everything under privilege. Unfortunately, nowadays, everybody gets sued. And as was brought up in my bio, I've been the expert witness on probably 12 or 13 of the biggest breaches this country's ever had. There are hundreds of millions. One of them was well over $1 billion lawsuit. But whether you're a small company or a big company, you lose people's PII, you lose people's PCI, right? It's a problem. So if you get attacked, law firm and a cyber company that knows what they're doing, that can actually help negotiate. And by the way, on the polling question, you're absolutely right. 3.86 million is the answer. Average cost of a breach. I will tell you, by the way, though, just think about this for a second. That's the average cost of a breach that we know has been reported. Remember what I told you a little while ago? I came out of the FBI, and I don't know how many thousands of breaches I did, and I talked to the FBI one time, and I love the FBI. But so that's the average cost of reported breaches. In one of the expert witness cases that I worked for a company on their side of the house, just to give you an idea, they spent $36 million to win the lawsuit. 36 million to win it. Now, if they had lost, it was $500 million. But think of that. If you don't have that type of capital within your company, this is literally the end of your corporation if you suffer and then receive civil litigation because of not looking at your data privacy, and then obviously looking at how your cyber infrastructure is set up. I think one of the big things people should understand, I brought it up a little bit in my earlier point, this is $1 trillion business. Literally, it eclipses almost every other type of organized crime. And by the way, it can be done by one person with a laptop in a foreign country or in a state way far away from you. And then they can shut the laptop and move, and they're very, very hard to catch. And there's a big difference between, obviously, criminal organized crime, I would call those hackers, versus state. When I say state, I'm talking about China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, which we'll touch a little bit when I hit on some of these highlighted stories that we're going to talk about, or investigations that I was involved in. Organized crime around ransomware, malware, people that are solely employed as a mercenary to hack and launch these attacks has taken off in the last several years. It is $1 trillion industry, and unfortunately, they're getting better and better and better. When we talk about insider threat, remember I talked to you about really I differentiate this in two different ways. Some of the things that we see take place in private sector organizations, and by the way, this is by far the number one, is what I brought up, is a good employee that's got no malice intended for the company, but because of job, life, workforce balance, they click on something, they download something, and then the IT infrastructure is compromised. The other point is third-party vendors, and I would list them down as contract employees. And a lot of companies nowadays, and my company is no different, you outsource different pieces of a company that in the old days was always in the company, right? You'll either outsource your HR, you outsource your payroll, you outsource your insurance. Any of these third-party contractors, and when I say contractors, it's just not a contractor that you have working for you, helping you do accounting during tax season or whatever. I mean, everybody that's connected to your company. So if there's third-party contractor companies, if I can't get into your company, the next best thing for me to do is get into a company that's connected to you. And once that happens, I'm into your company. So third-party risk, insider threat is huge. We get asked to come in and look at mergers and acquisitions constantly. So when you're getting ready to buy or partner with another company, let alone if you've outsourced your HR or anything else, what's their infrastructure look like? I'm telling you, 2 years ago, people would look at you crazy if you asked them, what kind of cyber protection do you have? What do you have laying over your endpoints? What do you have up as a managed security service provider? Do you even know what that is? Most companies will look at you crazy. But those type of questions nowadays are valid questions, because if they're connected into your company or they're connected into your employees, it's risk. And then obviously if there's anybody in your company that has malicious intent in the private sector, that happens. But it's low compared to everything else that we're talking about, quite frankly. So let's talk about this. For a criminal organization and for somebody that's looking to feed off of chaos, COVID-19 is a perfect storm when it comes to cyber. It just is. So listen, bad guys, bad gals, when they're looking at attacking you, they want there to be a cloud of dust around whatever they're doing. And because of COVID, and because of the increased businesses that have been failing, and also companies that are trying to respond and keep their companies afloat, a natural byproduct of that is pushing people out. pushing people so that they don't get COVID, they're secure and their family's secure, but that the company can still function. And the number of unsecure remote desktop machines in this country has risen incredibly. And by the way, even the ones that they think are secure, I would offer that they're not. I think the number is astronomical right now. And I think one of the things you can be doing, and there's some of these on questions you submitted earlier, we're going to talk to you about, is thinking out ahead of that, right? Because even if a vaccine comes, even if people take the vaccine, we're still looking at months and months and months and months and months of this new normal. Why? Because the COVID crisis is now increasing across the United States. Doesn't matter which side of the virus you're on, it's just fact. It's interrupting business, and people are now out in their residences and out in standalone offices with not a lot of IT support, not a lot of people that they can go in and just ask questions to. And the number of cyber crimes and cyber criminals that are attacking these companies is astronomically risen. When a criminal can get into or defeat or make softer a vulnerability, which this does to everyone unless you're constantly up on the latest technologies, it opens the door to ransomware attacks. It opens the door to malware attacks. It opens the door for surveillance activities in and around those companies so that I can watch you. People need to understand when you, a couple slides ago, when you saw, I think the average time for a breach was 280 days or whatever. In the Bureau, when I was there running a lot of these operations, most of the time the companies never found a breach. And these are big, sophisticated companies. Most of the time we would find it from another source, and then we would send agents out to talk to the companies and say, hey, listen, you need to look right here because we think you've been compromised for a year and a half. Now picture that. If somebody's been in your system for a year and a half, which by the way, that is quite routine, they know everything about that company. I don't care if it's a 5-person company, a 30-person company, or a 400-person company. And they are able to launch higher frequency, more sophisticated attacks. And so unfortunately, the COVID crisis has made a huge spike in cybercrime across the United States. And I would look at how you're communicating over virtual networks. I don't care if it's GoToMeetings, I don't care if it's Zoom, I don't care how you do it. But you need to be at least open and understanding of what are the vulnerabilities, even if it's open source information, and what we should and should not be talking about, or what we should or should not be posting up on when we're doing shared screens with slides. One of the things that we get asked all the time, because, and we're part of this too, I have quarterly board meetings, which I have board members all over this country. And we have taken very strict measures on how we share our quarterly board financial information and clients and anything we're doing. And I would tell you, if you're doing anything, especially in the accounting world with your clients, which we all are, right? Just make sure you're aware of the risks. And so just take those, you don't got to be, scared out of your mind, but you need to understand, okay, there's a risk. How do I minimize that risk? And how do we set up presentations, or how do we cover numbers with clients to make sure that we're all safe? One of the things that we're definitely going to hit on here in a few minutes, which honestly, when it comes to cybersecurity and cybersecurity posture, which I equate to like, where are you right now? Are you in a defensive posture, an offensive posture, or do you not know? Most companies, unfortunately, don't know. That's fine. But what you need to kind of start to look at is, do I understand what my IT company actually does? I think this is incredibly important because I will tell you, in most cases, I don't think people actually understand that. I don't think they understand, we've got a slide on it later, between what's a managed service provider or managed security service provider, what's the difference between an IT company and a cyber company, and how do you make sure that this is taken care of? It's interesting. And it's great that in this poll that over 50% of you have a current, at least cybersecurity program. The one thing I will tell you when it comes to cybersecurity, don't ever get stagnant. In other words, don't ever be comfortable. If you're comfortable in what your cybersecurity posture is, if you think you've got it nailed down and you think there's not much else to do, you're in trouble. If somebody walks into your office, I don't care if it's even me, and I tell you, I got this, don't worry about it, we're good, you don't have to worry about a thing for another year, fire me. Because I'm telling you, that's not the way it works anymore. Cybersecurity, you don't have to spend a lot of money. That's what I think, unfortunately, a lot of consulting companies do. They keep telling you, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do this. Some cases you might. In most cases, everybody's got a budget and you can only operate within that budget. So a lot of the things that we're talking about doesn't take hardly any money at all. It just takes you to be aware, and you need to constantly be touching your cybersecurity and understanding where you're at on that continuum, right? It's a bell curve. And sometimes you're going to be at a point where you got almost no risk because everything's just working perfect. Then all of a sudden a new type of attack comes out, or a new type of infrastructure, or you hire 20 people and your company's growing. Now all of a sudden you've got to put out more VPNs, more desktops, more laptops, more endpoint problems. All of a sudden maybe your risk goes up a little bit. You just constantly need to be aware of it, because cyber criminals are. And cyber criminals go where there's data. And I'm not trying to scare you. Law firms, accounting firms, huge targets. Why? You've got everybody's data. And that's what bad guys want. They want data. They can sell it. They can manipulate it. They can extort you for it. It causes a huge brand reputation for you if they sell it out on the open market. It could cause you to lose clients. It could cause your business to fail. So when we're looking at this overall, you really got to take that piece of this seriously. And again, it could be one person in your company that's in charge to keep up with the latest kind of what's going on out there in the world, or get a cyber intelligence feed from a company, or have a cyber company that you can talk to and give you advice throughout the year. Doesn't mean they got to come in and do some crazy proactive overview or risk assessment and cost a bunch of money. It may be something simpler than, can you have a conversation with me? Can you have an hour time where I lay out what my infrastructure is and I kind of tell you what my concerns are and what I do? That's what I'm talking about. And that's the kind of relationship. You have a relationship, I guarantee it, with your lawyer or your law firm or whoever. You need to have a trusted relationship with a cybersecurity company, not just an IT company. If you notice, I've not brought up IT one time. My company does not do IT. That's not what we do. We are a cyber security company. And I think that's important. IT companies do IT. You really need specialized men and women working in your company with technology when it comes to actual cybersecurity. Obviously, some of the things besides data is intellectual property. And by the way, intellectual property nowadays is not just stealing the product. It may be stealing the way your business operates. In other words, if you've got a great market share in the state of Delaware or wherever you are for whatever your company does, people don't just attack you now to steal that widget. They attack you now to steal how you got to that market share. How do you run your board? How do you go out and search for clients? How do you make those clients go from a prospective client to somebody that is now on the books and you're working with them? It's very sophisticated. So they're not just looking to steal a piece of something. They may be looking to steal, how did you get as big as you are as quick as you did? Intellectual property is huge. If you have any type of financial information, which we brought up, and obviously everybody on this call does, or healthcare information or corporate data, huge targets nowadays. There's a huge talent shortage in the market for really good cyber information security specialists. And so for you to actually try to hire these people and put them into your company, I think it's almost cost prohibitive nowadays, but that's something you guys could look at. But the bigger thing is keeping them current. The problem with, and I could tell you, we work with a lot of large companies, major airlines, giant companies that build really big, construction equipment and so on and so forth. So once they go into that environment, they become experts of that company and that culture and that IT infrastructure and their cybersecurity, which is great. But they don't see the thousands of attacks a company like mine or other companies like this see. So you see the trends, you see the changes. When we layer managed security software over people's endpoints, every time there's a vulnerability, that comes out in artificial intelligence, and we automatically lay it across all of our other clients. You can't get that in-house. Years ago, you could. It moves so quick nowadays, it's something I would caution you to think about as opposed to working with a trusted partner. You need to be thinking about, and I'm hitting this hard because these attacks are off the hook. What if, right? If I get hit with a $25,000 ransomware attack and the clock's ticking, which it will be, what do I do? If I'm one or two or three person company, maybe I can just cut everything away and start up again. 25, 50, 75 people, I doubt it. You got to know where your data is, and if it's in the cloud, it's not in the cloud, right? It's in a server farm someplace in Tennessee or out west of Washington, right? So where's my data? Is my data commingled? Most people don't have any idea about this, by the way. How quick does it take me to get my data back? In almost every breach or reaction we go to, we had one this past weekend. Millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of files gone. Well, where's your data? I know, we can get it back in 24 hours. Well, it's been 10 days. They still don't have their data back from their server farm. So you need to be asking yourself, what if, right? What if we get hit? What if there's a number? Will you pay the ransom? Will you not? I will tell you right now, I won't make that decision for you. I would advise you one way or the other, but it's usually up to the CEO and the board of the company or whoever owns the company. That's your decision to pay the ransom or not. A company like mine can facilitate it for you and pay it for you, but that's your decision. You need to make that decision, and you need to be thinking about it way before this happens. Way before this happens. Talk to a law firm that's knowledgeable in cyber and cyber crime. Not necessarily a law firm that you're going to get to write, your will or anything like that. You want a law firm that's used to dealing with cyber insurance agencies, which I'm going to touch on regarding ransomware in a second, or cyber crime. Do you notify law enforcement or not? In most cases, honestly, if it's a small ransomware breach, the FBI is not going to help, and that's nothing against the FBI. It's just a scale. Local or state may or may not, depending where you're at and depending on how busy they are, right? But I definitely would advise, if you think something's going out the door, to make sure you contact your lawyer and contact a good cyber company that can help you figure out what happened. When we talk about ransomware and we talk about making a payment, most of you probably don't know, you always hear about Bitcoin. There's 700 virtual currencies in the world. Bad guys use a lot of them. If you've never procured Bitcoin before, it can take days depending on the amount of it. So these are the type of things at a board, ownership level, CEO, executive leadership. I don't care if it's a two-person company. Whoever's in charge needs to be thinking about this. What are we going to do? How do we get this done? Who do we know that can make that happen for us? The problem most of the time, and I will tell you 95% of the time, whether it's a giant company or a little company, the time that they're thinking about that is when that event is happening. And that's not the right time to do it because everybody's uptight. You're in the middle of a crisis. You're not making the best decisions because you don't have time. And you really are trying to understand what's going on to your company at the same time that you're trying to save your company. And I can't stress this enough. I have been involved in, thousands and thousands of breaches, and some of the biggest ones ever. And unfortunately, I got to tell you, in most cases, that's exactly what's happening. People have not thought about that until it happens. So if you don't listen to anything else I say today, train your employees, think about what's going to happen if something bad happens and how do you recover from that. So one of the things you can do to protect your business, right? Be proactive. Proactive is exactly what I just talked about a few minutes ago. Is I don't got to spend $10,000 a month or $1 million a year. I need to understand what's going on in this environment, whether that's by going on the internet, reading stuff, employing somebody for a cyber security feed that talks about the greatest threats, or twice a year, sitting down for an hour with a company that does it for a living and say, tell me what's going on out there. Tell me where the threats are. Tell me how I can protect my company better. You got to do that. You have to be proactive. If you're not proactive, you're going to get rolled over. And it's just a matter of time, because like I told you, although there are very targeted attacks, we'll talk about Sony a little later, a very strategic targeted attack. Most of these are not, but regardless, it's a roll of the dice before potentially something happens to your company. I can't stress this enough. At our company, we don't call anybody a client, we call them a partner. There's a reason for that. You have to have the trust of the men and women that are going to come in, and remember this, they're coming in the worst case scenario in your company. Something really bad has happened and now everything's off the tracks. And in some cases, some of the companies we work with, they'll tell us flat out, we have to be back up and running because of our overhead in 6 hours. After 6 hours, we potentially need to lay people off. There's other companies that say they can function for 6 days. There's a few companies that we work with that have enough reserves in the bank that they might be able to function for 2 weeks to a month, but they're very few, very, very few of those companies, by the way, that we work with, and we work with a lot. Depending on your infrastructure, depending on your overhead, that's important. So somebody you trust, legal counsel, a cyber firm, doesn't matter who, but you got to trust them. And then the other thing is, and you'll hear me talk about this a lot later on, look at cybersecurity in a business context, right? Don't just look at it as a check mark on a spreadsheet to present to the senior leadership to say, we've checked this box. Forget about that. Everybody's got a budget, whether it's $1,000 a year to spend on it or $1 million a year. Rack and stack your clients and your company and where you think the risk is greatest. And then you can start employing different techniques within that to try to minimize that risk. Eventually, if you have the revenue or capital enough to bring in an outside firm, they can help you with that. And then you can, over time, you can look at how much you need to put into this, how much money you want to spend, and you fix the top 1 or 2 things each quarter, each year, each 2 years, but you constantly touch it. And that's why you need somebody that you want to work with, trust. And by the way, when you sit down with a cyber security company, go right at them. Ask them a bunch of questions. Ask them how many breaches they've done. Ask them how many ransomware pay. Ask them if they have IT infrastructure experts on board. Ask them if they understand IT architecture. Ask them if they know how to run. Do they actually have a real 24-man security operations center with real people in it? Or did they just review logs, right? There's a bunch of questions you can ask so that you can get to the bottom. Look, I'm telling you, in this industry, people will throw out a bunch of 3-letter acronyms and a whole bunch of high-speed, abbreviations, but they're an inch deep and a mile wide, right? You need to really dig down into it to understand, hey, does this guy or gal that's sitting in front of me really understand? And think of it this way: in my worst day in this company, to stay operational, to make sure that I'm going to be able to pay my employees, to continue my business, do I want that person sitting right next to me handling whatever's going to happen? Not to mention protecting the reputation of you and your company. And honestly, I think it's easy to make that choice once you do something like that. But that's how I look at it. Let's hit this, because I want to make sure we have enough time to hit our questions and a couple stories before you guys open up the questions. IT versus cybersecurity, completely confusing to a lot of people. MSP versus MSSP. I cannot tell you how many companies I go into and my teams go into and they say, no, our IT company does all of our cybersecurity. I would have to disagree. I told you early on, I don't do IT. If I did IT, I'd have an IT company. IT companies that tell you they do cybersecurity, I would ask them flat out, tell me what you mean by that. because I'm employing you to make sure that my servers, my laptops, my desktops, remember, if you don't know what I'm talking about, they're the people you call and that you give control of your screen and you see the cursor moving all over the place, right? With remote desktop so they can fix it. And the reason I say this is a lot of people say, no, they're doing my cybersecurity, and I'm here to tell you they are not. And that's nothing against an IT company. Quite frankly, they're an IT company. They should be doing your IT. People confuse MSP versus MSSP. MSP, think IT. Cybersecurity or something laying on your endpoints is MSSP. It's that simple, but they look a lot alike, right? You want to manage security service provider, a company like ours or others that can lay across your network, either outside your firewall or inside, or however we decide to design it with you, on your endpoints and all your phones and on all your laptops without messing up your business, without messing up the speed of which your business functions, but can alert you immediately before things get really bad. That MSSP will work with your IT company to make sure that the IT infrastructure understands what's going on with the threats. That's a very important distinction. And I just want everybody to know that. And you should be thinking that way. Let's hit this polling question here. One of the things I want to talk about is some quick tips before I think we get to the questions, and then maybe I cover some stories. I would totally look at your corporation and look at, one, your Active Directory, and the way you use your corporate communications. What I mean by Active Directory is who's actually in your directory. Is it up to date? Do you take out people that have left the company, not left the company? People's positions change and their accesses should change within your company to what they have. I will tell you, most companies don't do this, and over years and years and years, you've got an Active Directory with 600 people in it, and you only have 80 people in your company. And so look at your Active Directory, look at how you communicate across email, and how you also look at, does the access, passwords, and practices of people and their jobs change? Have you updated that? You know, I'm going to talk about Ed Snowden. I'm going to talk about Sony. I'm going to talk about OPM. I ran all those things. And I can tell you a lot of those things could have been avoided by doing just what we're talking about right here. Also, Wi-Fi. Don't want to freak anybody out. I rode the train from DC to New York constantly. When I was in the FBI, I rode the train when I did my first practice, when I first came out. I had 1 million miles on United in 1 year. The Wi-Fi on Amtrak, and this is nothing against Amtrak, the Wi-Fi in a Starbucks, the Wi-Fi on United, or pick another area, I don't care. These areas are easily compromised, and there are people that sit on those trains, planes, coffee shops, and by the way, I'm not picking on any of these companies, I love them all, to do nothing but steal, get into, or exploit your laptop, your cell phone. You can avoid all this with, you know, a $30 a month MiFi that you can get from a gazillion different organizations that's secure, that you can put your employees on. I know it's cost. You've got to worry about, is this the right cost for what I'm trying to do for my company and my employees? I'm telling you, I'm putting my FBI hat on. I'm telling you, in all those different areas, there's bad guys, bad gals that just sit there day after day, and their whole job is to steal whatever they can steal for anybody that logs onto that network. Something to think about. Multi-factor authentication. If you're not using it, start using it. Everybody in your company is going to complain for about a week. After that, no one's going to even realize they're doing it. If you know what I'm talking about, you can do multi-factor authentication. You can do 2-factor. You can do 3-factor. You can go crazy and do fingerprint or a card or a whole bunch of other stuff. The reason you want multi-factor authentication, it will stop 99.9% of any of these other erroneous attacks that we've talked about, because it's authenticating who you are. We can get into, which we won't today, but there's a myriad of ways that you can set up algorithms in big companies to make sure this is actually Bob Anderson logging on, or Bob Anderson just tried to log on from New Jersey and we just saw a log on from Washington State. Something's wrong. Let's shut his access off. You guys don't need to do that, but multi-factor authentication is huge. If you're not using it, you should use it. It will cost your company almost nothing. It will decrease your risk exponentially. Your employees will probably struggle with it for a week, especially the older employees, not being mean, but they just will. I see it all the time. After that, it just becomes normal, right? Some of you I know are still using this because I have a lot of friends and a lot of different accounting firms in and around the state of Delaware. You really need to be thinking about what you're doing if you let people access their computers with any type of thumb drive, external data source, external soft or hard drive. And if you are letting them do that, you need to train employees repeatedly that they are not allowed in any way, shape, or form to use that in their personal life versus their business life. Because what ends up happening is they commingle data. Some of that data may be corrupted, some of it may be not. And then the unfortunate thing is they're plugging it into your system. So as far as the overall just kind of presentation today, that's the end of my presentation. I would like to cover, you guys have written in a lot of really good questions, and hit those real quick. And then I'd like to give you a quick overview on the 3 cases I've talked about. And then, as we talked about earlier, allowing the last 15 minutes or so for any other questions that you have, quite frankly, about anything. You'll find I'm a fairly direct person. I don't mind answering them. If I can't answer something, I'll tell you, but overall. One of the questions early on was about Dropboxes, or can I use Dropbox, transfer information securely versus over the internet? I think Dropbox is great. You can use it in utilization with a VPN or not. You can either store or share the files encrypted, which I think is great. I think, let me just say something about Dropbox, OneDrive, SharePoint, all that stuff. A lot of that stuff nowadays have built-in security features. So if you're using that and you're using a VPN, a virtual private network on top of that, awesome. And so I would highly recommend that you do that. It's easy to set up and pass your confidential data or data that you don't want anybody seeing through that. So I think that's very good. Along the same lines, I will tell you, it's funny. When I was in the FBI, obviously, because there's a lot of rules and regulations, because not everybody, but I had a top secret, still do have a top secret SCI clearance, but you were not allowed to use any type of devices on cellular data or cell phones. It was very strict. Well, when you come out to the private sector, most of you already know this, everybody is communicating over some type of encrypted data, whether it's Signal or some other app that everybody has. And they're doing this not to manipulate or hide from law enforcement. They're doing it for the reasons we're talking about, right? Is to secure the data of their clients. So think outside the box. You can definitely use Dropbox, VPNs in conjunction with that on top of OneDrive or SharePoint Drive. But I'm just conveying what I see. A lot of communications also come over these encrypted apps. Protective measures, a whole bunch of you asked about this. Like, what's the biggest protective measures that we can do? If I'm starting a small business, I got to prioritize my critical business needs through antivirus and firewalls. I'm agnostic to technology, our company is. So my point is there's a bunch of firewall and antiviruses out there on the open market that I think are adequate. But I would tell you, in conjunction with that, the best thing you can do is 2-factor authentication, which is huge. The use of a virtual private network, which is a variety of those out there nowadays. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google VPN. It's easy to set up and easy to use, and you will reduce the risk of your company exponentially. And then the last thing I would say on protective measures, remember when I talked about educating your employees and staying on top of the threat? You have to do that. You have to do that, especially depending on what you're doing. Because data is what you guys have, and that's what people want. Best practice for collecting and storing personal information. I will tell you right now, you should be working with your lawyer. Here's why. For PII, and if any of you have clients overseas, now GDPR, privacy, and other laws that are surround personnel's PII vary depending on state and GDPR regulations if you have any clients overseas. So my point is, depending where you're at, talk to your legal counsel and then segregate this data. One of the best things I've seen, and it's simple for companies that track clients' data or track who the client is, especially if you say, you know, Bob Anderson's client, date of birth is this, social security is that, driver's license number is this, right? That's a train wreck if that gets stolen. Train wreck, right? A lot of companies now are code wording Bob Anderson, so follow me through on this. Bob Anderson becomes 1, you know, Sally becomes 2, James becomes 3. And so all you see is number 1, the date of birth, and maybe it's just half the social security or whatever. In a separate database, number 1 is Bob Anderson. So you and your company understand who that is. But even if somebody stole all of your data, they don't know how that lines back up. Therefore, it is harder for them to steal identities, open credit cards, submit fraudulent taxes. You get where I'm going on this. So PII, you got to compartmentalize it. Talk to your lawyer depending where you're at because state guidelines vary. GDPR if you're overseas, and you need stuff like companies like mine and other companies have experts on board that can handle that for you and tell you how to do it. But you need to be thinking about it. And then, like I said, take some measure, a simple measure of segregating that data. You can do what I just said. A lot of companies are, I mean, big companies are doing it that way now. But just take that precaution. I will tell you on the lawsuit side, the more proactive you are, the better off when you go into a lawsuit. In other words, when you sit down at that table and everybody's being videoed and interviewed for weeks at a time, the fact that the company was proactive looking at measures and proactively taking steps, yeah, you might have got breached, yeah, the data might have got out. I'm telling you, the fact that you were proactively trying to make sure it didn't goes a long way. One of the other questions that everybody had, small membership association, budget conscious, how do we consciously protect without spending a lot of money? I'll go back to exactly what I just said before. I'm telling you, 2-factor authentication, making sure that you've taken steps around your PII, be proactive in talking to your lawyer, proactive in talking to a cybersecurity company, not an IT company. The IT company's got to work with a cybersecurity company and look at it that way. Evolution of cybercrime and threats, pressure on small businesses to stay current. Differences between Google or Apple security force, and is there any kind of one guideline? So here's what I will tell you. Google, Microsoft, Apple, all these people nowadays on all their products, they're building into them some aspects of security, which make them way better than they used to be. As far as a standard, if you're looking for a standard, NIST or ISO are kind of the published national standards out there, NIST or ISO, NIST or ISO, you can look them up. They get very detailed. I will tell you, for a small and medium business, you're probably not going to use one or the other. If a firm like ours came in, we're going to look at your company and look at what you're doing and then take the best out of each of those, and then we'll formulate a practice for your company. But you can do the same thing. You can go into NIST right on the website, or you can go into ISO, and they'll go down 15 or 25 different criteria, and you can go, well, that fits me, that fits me, that fits me. And so you don't need to spend money. You can go down it and start looking at it and go, you know what, that's something that I think we can implement without you know, a lot of money or a lot of time. We talked, there's a lot of questions about penetration testing. We covered VPN and current threats, like for metadata and stuff like that. So I'm going to hit them all kind of real quick. Penetration testing is good, I will say, only if you have a handle on your current level of information security status. In other words, if you don't know if your IT infrastructure or what you're doing in your company is good, bad, indifferent, for me to come in and get a bunch of my men or women to break into your company, because basically penetration testing, a little different than vulnerability scanning, is the ability to penetrate into your company's IT infrastructure and move around like a bad guy. Usually do this with a lot of legal waivers in place, and it's done over a period of time. That's not actually when the company's running, so that you can operate and not, limit business operations. I would say don't do that unless you actually understand, because it's going to be useless to you. A lot of companies will try to sell it to you real quick and say, oh, we'll do a penetration test. Well, that's great. It's like, I'm going to go leave one of the windows or doors open in my house. Go try to get in and let me know if you did. Well, yeah, well, you're going to get in, right? So it's better to have an understanding before then. A bunch of people asked about VPNs. I'm going to hit it again. There's a million of them out there. Highly, highly, highly recommend using a virtual private network. If your company's bigger, if you have a bigger infrastructure, if you have more IT than your one man or woman can handle, I would tell you I would recommend you look at a managed security service provider to lay technology over your endpoints and in your infrastructure to allow your IT side of your house to function as a real IT, and then let the men and women that do cybersecurity and infrastructure secure that for you. Here's one thing I will tell you when you're looking at an MSSP. You need to ask them, well, if you see a threat, I know you're going to notify my IT company, but are you or do you have the tools, that's the key word, the capability of surrounding that threat and locking it off from the rest of my company until we can remediate it? If the answer is not yes, move on, right? Because what they're doing is selling you something that just allows them to read your logs, right? That's like remember, you take an access card to get into a building, somebody can go read that log. Think of it the same way. And most of the time, they're going to read those logs 2, 3, 4 weeks after they've been generated, which means the compromises happened way before they've told you, right? You need a company that can surround it, hold it off, remediate it, and advise you of what we're doing. If not, you need to find another company. That's my opinion, because the threats move so quickly nowadays. And as far as spam or educating your employees, that was another question. I think, quite frankly, there's a lot of really good companies that do nothing but that type of education out there nowadays. And if you want something like that, they can provide an hour block virtually, quarterly, every 2 times a year or once a year. And sort of like what we did in this, like the employee has to go in and answer some questions. And that certifies to you that your employees actually watch this training, understand what spear phishing is, understand what spam is, understand what emails containing malware look like. Bunch of companies out there, highly recommend it. Not a big price point. You can do it for hundreds of dollars a year. It's all virtual and it's easy. All right, that's your questions. That's the kind of overview. Let me just hit these 3 cases real quick, just to let you know what's going on. And this shows you that large government, private sector companies are just as vulnerable as you are, even if you've got a 2-person company up to as big as your company wants to be. The OPM hack, which I was leading back in the day, is a great example of a nation state attack into this country. It was definitely done by China. They stole 23 million identities. They stole my identity and everything about it. Why did they go to OPM? How did they get into OPM? And why is it important? And why has none of that information showed up on the dark web or the black market to be sold? Easy. They're using it probably for intelligence gathering. And quite frankly, you had thousands and thousands of men and women like me that were in intelligence organizations that they now have our date of birth, our social security number, my entire top secret questionnaire, my finances, and a bunch of other stuff. But the point is, that's a nation state attack where China, which they did it, can leverage, which you would go to jail for, whether you believe it or not in this country, using their intelligence infrastructure to support an intelligence operation to break in to a government entity to solely do nothing but steal personal PII so that they can use it for offensive or reactive attacks in the coming years. Big deal. Why do I bring that up? We talked about PII and PCI a lot today. This is a perfect example. And by the way, unfortunately, I could bring up a bunch of these that nation states, for different reasons, are focused on the same thing as criminal organizations. For China, OPM was a gold mine. Perfect example of how employees, because outdated infrastructure, outdated IT, your company is much like the FBI and much like other companies. As your company grows, you add on IT infrastructure, right? You don't start all over. You don't have the money. You don't have the ability. If your company grows really quickly, you're so far past that and worried about your revenue numbers for that quarter that you're not thinking about it. The problem is it opens vulnerabilities. OPM is a perfect example of that, right? Perfect example of vulnerabilities that if employees were trained a little better, if the infrastructure was a little newer, that attack would have never happened. Let's hit Sony Pictures and Ed Snowden real quick, and then we can open it up for questions in the last 10 or 15 minutes. So Sony, perfect example of what I brought up earlier about when you're looking at risk to your company, and I'm going to add on to this. Remember I told you two-factor authentication, VPN, if you can use it, right? Dropbox is great. Training your employees. Here's the next thing all of you need to be thinking about, because we're all the same anymore. Your life is on your phone. You have your work email. You have your private email. You have your social media apps. You have LinkedIn. You have Facebook. You have Snapchat. I can go on and on and on and on. Unfortunately, that is all attack vectors for bad guys and bad gals. The Sony attack took less than 10 minutes. It cost hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. It turned 8,000 plus computers into bricks and almost bankrupted a multi-billion-dollar company. Whole thing took less than 10 minutes, launched from overseas, all came in through social media apps. And they had been in the company forever, months and months and months and months and months before they launched the attack. So when you're talking to your employees, and this is the key to this whole brief on this company and this attack, when you're looking at your company and you're looking at how everybody lives their life, you have to make a decision on what is secure for you. What is okay for your employees to do? You're not trying to run their personal life. You're not trying to be Big Brother, but you as a company definitely have the responsibility of limiting the scale and scope of an attack that could potentially happen through social media apps. And it's hard. We have these conversations a lot with a lot of companies. And it's something you need to be thinking about. I bring this up solely to show you, right? First one's nation state, PII, just like we're talking about, very focused attack. Second one, absolutely North Korea, not really worried about the nation state aspect of it. I'm telling you that it comes through social media apps. We see attack vectors from criminal organizations, nation state attacks all the time using these attack vectors. Something you, as the head of whatever company I'm talking to, need to think about. Because if something goes wrong, it's going to come back to you. So you need to think about it. Last one real quick, and then we'll open up for questions. Ed Snowden, perfect example. Regardless of how you come down on, was Ed Snowden a hero to the United States or was he a criminal? Ed Snowden is a perfect example of an insider that once somebody's in your company, it really doesn't matter the security protocols that you have in place. If they understand them, they can bypass them. And then they can use that ability to get into areas of your company that they may or may not have access to ordinarily. Remember I asked you to talk about and think about your Active Directory and look at the number of passwords you have files for your employees and stuff like that, right? If you have 80 employees and you have 600 people in your Active Directory and you have no idea who's got the different compartments and who can see the financial information versus different information on your clients, especially an accounting firm, depending on who those clients are or who actually works on the data or stores the data, something for you to think about. Most insiders, and I have arrested, unfortunately, a bunch of real spies in my career. Remember, real spies are like me, guys that have got TSSCI clearances, trusted with the keys to the kingdom, and for some reason, something went wrong, and they've decided to sell all this stuff now to a foreign power. If an employee like that is mad, disgruntled, didn't get promoted, didn't get a bonus, frustrated with the company, I will tell you that 99% of the spies, real spies, that I've arrested, that's why they became a spy. It wasn't because they wanted to go make money. It was because they were mad. They were upset. They were frustrated. They didn't think that they were getting paid enough, promoted enough. And for whatever reason, that clicked the switch and they decided to go that way. So the reason I bring up Ed Snowden has nothing to do with anything other than if somebody is in your company and somebody is disgruntled and they have access or they're not cordoned off or segmented off from that access, they can cause problems. And so the last thing I would say to you around cyber, if you're going to remove a person from your company because they're not keeping up with the team or other reasons, have a plan that the day that's presented, accesses are cut off, information is retrieved. There's a set protocol on how you get back all the data. And if they haven't signed a form, it's something you might want to be thinking about, that they can't leave with any of the data for the company. So anyway, that's it on those. And I would gladly entertain in the last few minutes any questions that we have. And I really want to appreciate you guys having me today, and hopefully it was beneficial.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. We do have a couple more questions in from the participants. The first one is, they are a nonprofit scientific research company. We have scientists that have work laptops and they install games and other home-based software on them. I don't like the practice, but there isn't much support for changing this practice. Are my concerns valid?
Yes. So the sad part about this, and I was laughing, and it's not because I'm, years ago, I was in charge of a project that the FBI was involved to involve our nuclear weapons lab. So I got to meet some of the brightest physicists in the world. And so scientific community in general does not like you to stifle their synergy or work amongst each other. The one thing I will tell you is, and I think they'll see it from this side if you can present it to them, you need to structure the conversation around you want to protect what they're doing for your company. Don't look at it as I'm trying to protect the company from you, which that happens. But the bottom line is you're trying to protect what they're doing from being stolen out of your company. And so you come at the issue from a slightly different way. I will tell you, this is not going to be an easy endeavor, but it's something that you need to look at. It's a good fear, but look at it from that standpoint. You're trying to help them protect their work.
Okay, what steps should a business take if an email was compromised and now we are seeing many tailored emails in various phishing attempts?
Yeah, so you can do a couple things. So you can change the email of that employee. You can strip it from your system. You can also push out throughout the entire company that you need to, the employees of the company need to understand that you've already been a victim of an attack and there are emails coming in that look very similar. So if you're in question, pick up the phone and call Bob or Jane or whoever and make sure it's their email. And in some companies, what you'll do is to go right into the Active Directory instead of, R. Anderson at cyberdefense.com, it will become Robert Anderson at cyberdefense.com. So there's a lot of ways to stop and change that, but the biggest thing is to push out to the company that we've been a victim of this attack and to be on the lookout for emails that look very similar to the employee that was compromised.
Okay, great. Are there other Wi-Fi systems to use instead of the normal Comcast and such that are more secure?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch. There really is nowadays. And the bigger thing when it comes to secure is like I said, there's a bunch of personal devices. I just referenced MiFi's that I think a lot of people use. But you can use different hotspots that are very, very secure. And I would say you can Google those. You'll come up with a bunch of different ones. And I think it's really going to be personal preference. My biggest thing is, if you really want to reduce your risk, do not log into open Wi-Fi's at coffee houses, airports, train stations. It's just, I am telling you, there are men and women, that is their job. They sit there to steal information. Now, don't go into the coffee house, like looking all around, right? Worried that somebody's going to jump out. Yeah, that's not going to happen. But a MiFi or some type of virtual device is the way to go.
Okay, what should companies do to secure cell phones used by employees?
Hard question. Some companies don't let employees have cell phones depending what business they're in at their actual workstations because they don't want them to be able to take pictures of people's data, right? And so you don't show a download then, right? If you're monitoring a system, but it doesn't mean that that employee may or may not be able to steal or misuse that data by their camera. So I think you need to look at your company. You need to look at what do you do and how do you secure it? And so whether it's apps, whether it's practices of using social media at work versus outside of work, that's something individual companies need to look at. I will tell you though, attack vectors nowadays are really hitting social media. And my son hates this because he's a doctor now, but you know, years ago when he was in college, he would open up Facebook or whatever, and I'd see, you know, not that I was like spying on him, but I'd see there was like 900 friends. And I would say to him, like, you don't know any of these people, right? Oh, no, I do. They're my friends. Well, no, they're not. You don't know who they are. And so what I'd say to you on these social media apps nowadays, once I'm connected to you, if I'm a bad guy or a gal, I have access to manipulate that data. So when it comes to companies, it's a tough decision. You need to talk about it and do whatever's best for your company on limiting access to some of this stuff.
So that's all the additional questions we had. Do you have any last comments you wanted to add?
No, I really appreciate you guys letting me talk to you today. Like I said, if you only remember a couple things, definitely be proactive, understand what's going on in your environment, use multi-factor authentication, and don't log on to open Wi-Fi's. And then if you ever need a professional, just reach out and talk to somebody that actually knows the business. But thank you so much. It was really nice.
Well, I want to thank everyone again for attending, and I hope you benefited from the information that was shared. A really special thank you to Bob for speaking and sharing his insight and expertise to our group. Thank you again for joining us today, and everyone, please take good care.